there's a range of opinions, but many, many, many women were killed, by people who felt they were doing very, very good things, but there was no internal censor. A healthy personality, as Freud pointed out, has an internal censor, and is able to balance, appropriately and integrate competing values. And again, the definition of idolatry or extremism is when, one value or a distorted view of one value overwhelms all other values. That's actually idolatry. That's what the entire Hebrew biblical idea was against. I mean, if there would be one core idea, Levi, that I would say represents, the Hebrew, tradition, I would say it's not love. I'd say that it is balance. Mm-hmm. Balance. Balance. It's the word shalom that we both know well, right? The shalom actually means in Hebrew, in the careful sense of the word, it means something like balance. It means shalem, which means whole, and whole means, in the sources, meaning the ability to take opposing values, balance them, and create a larger whole. That's what, when Chaim Vital talks about the word shalom, that's what shalom means. It's not high, right? It's the ability to create a larger whole out of competing values, right? And the distortion, or the taking of any value, or particularly a distorted value, and transforming it into an absolute, is the definition of extremism in all of the evil it produces, right? And it's what we would call idolatry. It's Maimonides would call idolatry.
Now let's...
Please.
Now let's say you were a struggling writer and a publisher came along and offered you $250,000, but it's on the condition that you write the definitive Marc Gafni story. I mean, let's pretend you're not Marc Gafni. Someone like you. You're given a story like you've been written up, and you're told, I'll give you $250,000, but you have to do the best job on this man that's ever been done. Would you refuse it? Would you do it and say concentrate on the man's intellectual ideas? Would you jump into the complexity of human relationships, and how would you go about doing journalism on someone such as yourself?
I mean, the same way I would do it on Dennis Prager or anyone else. In other words, my life is no more dramatic, than any of the 10 people that you admire, right? I mean, not in any sense, shape, or form. Possibly much less dramatic, right? And I don't actually have a dramatic life. I have actually a kind of, in a certain sense, a very ordinary, life in its complexities. And I've wrestled with many of the issues of our age, and because, I grew up in Orthodoxy, so that kind of became kind of highlighted, in some sense. But I don't think, my story is obviously far less dramatic, than, let's say, Martin Luther King's. In other words, far less dramatic. I'm, decidedly boring. But let's take someone like Martin Luther King, right? You could focus, on Martin Luther King's or Gandhi's sexuality, where it was complex. Again, by comparison, I imagine, all the people that you admire are relatively simple, right? But or you could focus on, what J. Edgar Hoover decided to focus on, which was on King's extramarital affairs. That's always the case. That's the case, about McCain, and that's the case about, the elder Bush, and it's the case about Clinton, and I can go down the list, and it's the case about, I'm sure, the 5 people you most admire. That's always the case. In other words, there's always a question of, do we want to focus on the, I think whenever you would write about a person, you'd want to kind of focus on the larger vision. You want to focus on the human complexity. You'd want to kind of hold, a deep, fair, balanced vision. And I guess we come back to that word balanced, right?
So would you delve in, if someone, one of the people I admire most, let's say they'd been divorced several times, would you do you think that's even proper area for a journalist?
I think people you admire most have been divorced several times, actually.
Right. Should that just be completely ignored, or should it be dealt with gingerly, or how should a journalist dive into something like that?
I think it depends what the goal. I think there's a general question about what the goal of journalism is, right? And it's what's the goal of a biography. In order to answer the question, Levi, I think we have to kind of step back a little bit, right? And and ask the following question. Right? Why does someone write a biography? A biography is different than investigative journalism by its nature. What is the biography seeking to do? What's the role of the biographer? And those are all big questions, and I think there's different genres, of biography. But I think that in order to do it, minimally, what one would have to do is a biographer needs to be very, very sophisticated in order to be able to evaluate, first off, as you asked correctly, what's important and what's not important. Well, there's question one, right? Question two would be, how do I evaluate the nature of my sources, right? In other words, to be a good biographer, you need to be a good psychologist, a good investigator, a good, sociologist, which is why there's so few good biographers. But I think, for example, Bill Clinton, his biography, his autobiography, right? Mm-hmm. Decided to spend, I think, 3 sentences on Monica, right? In other words, there was a decision, right? What he was saying is that's not my legacy. Right. Other people might spend, at least 6 or 7 sentences. So I think those are questions. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. I think the key is to be able to be honest, to be fair, to discern between sources. That is to say, someone once wrote online, I believe you may know that person. I think his first name was Luke something. But, maybe like a neighbor of yours, right? Yeah. Who said, I just write whatever somebody tells me. I don't check whether it's true or not, right? Now, I don't think that's your system anymore, but I think you wrote that several years back. And I think, as you pointed out, we all evolve, right? But clearly, I couldn't more radically, as Judaism does, radically disagree with that, right? In other words, the notion that a biographer just writes what people tell them, right, is of course absurd, right? The biographer needs to be discerning, right? Needs to be able to create a hierarchy of reliability, right? Needs to be able to discern motivation, right? All of that, is the job of the good biographer. But let's move on to the next part of this topic. Enough on biographies.
Okay, wait. I want to defend myself from what.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
That's fine.
Please.
You always bring this up, so I just want to deal with it thoroughly. And
Please.
So I think I once said when people grill me about my technique, hey, I just write down what people tell me, and if such and such a pornographer tells me that he sticks bananas in a certain place of his anatomy, I write that.
His ear, I assume, is what you're referring to.
His ear, yes, his ear. And it doesn't matter to me whether it's true or not. If he's saying it about himself or that he sticks bananas in his ear, I find it interesting that he would say that whether or not he factually does stick bananas in his ear. So when I've had a daily column for much of the last 12 years, and when I would interview people, I pretty much would write down word for word what they told me, unless it was libelous, in that the context was given that this was an interview and this was a person, speaking in the same way that someone speaks on the radio. Like when you're interviewed on the radio, very rarely will the host, butt in and say, "I'm not going to let you say that." But in talk radio, there is a fair amount, a pretty free flow of discussion. And the same thing for my website. So if you said that John Doe was sexually molesting a 9-year-old, okay, that would not go on my website. But if you said that in your opinion Barack Obama sticks bananas in his ear every night, I would publish that without respect to whether I had any factual evidence that Barack Obama stuck bananas in his ear every night, because I just think it was a colorful and harmless quote.
Well, I think I am in no position to judge your website, so I don't want to. Let me take it away from that. But let me just say the last distinction you drew, is if you and every other blogger, will follow the distinction that you just drew, that would evolve the blogosphere dramatically. In other words, it's if someone would make a distinction between clearly libelous and vicious material and colorful material, which is the distinction that you just drew. I think that would be a good Judaic, Talmudic, evolutionary step forward. Sadly, one couldn't say that that's true about the blogosphere as a whole today, to measure an understatement.
Would you largely agree or entirely agree with the sentiments outlined in Joseph Telushkin's book on gossip? Did you ever read that book?
I did read that book.